Broadcasting live from the dungeon of the Mad Mage on the material plane. This is Tap Tap Concede. Welcome everybody to Tap Tap Concede. My name is Graham and joining me is Nelson.
Hi, I'm here.
And James.
What up?
Cameron is off this week. I said we were broadcasting from the dungeon of the Mad Mage, so we're going to talk a little bit about dungeons today, and specifically how dungeons act in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. But first, get out of your dungeon and get to Card Kingdom. I don't know, man. Yeah, sure. Why not? We're sponsored by Card Kingdom. Have been for ages because they're great. Go to cardkingdom.com/LRR and buy yourself some cards because they got great prices and excellent customer service and preposterously fast shipping. And you can tell them Loading Ready Run sent me button, please, and they'll give you a little 1-inch button, which right now says changelings are cowards, even though there is a slight typo. Though there's a new batch that's been sent over to them. So by the time you hear this and by the time you order, you may get a different button. Who knows? And also, of course, the show is brought to you by you and your kind support of our Patreon at patreon.com/loadingreadyrun. So a big question that I had was, what are they going to do with dungeons? And the only reason that was a question is because when they announced Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, which is the full name of the set, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to start calling it AFR.
That's okay.
Yeah. They showed off Tiamat, the big 5-color dragon, and then said, now that's only half of it because the game is Dungeons and Dragons, so you'll see what happens with dungeons later on. And it's like, whoa, huh? Okay. So there was a lot of different ideas. And the mechanics article came out. And now normally, I thought this was interesting. Get your, wow, I can't think of words today.
Who needs them?
We're experiencing a heat wave. The word for trying to figure out something in the future.
Predict?
Yeah, I guess maybe that's that. I don't know if that's the word I was thinking of, but that one works. Get your prediction engines ready for what this means. But normally the mechanics article is like, here's all the mechanics in the set, right? And it's like for Kaldheim, it was like, look, we got snow, there's changelings, there's foretell. We're going to lay out all the different like named mechanics that show up on a bunch of different cards in the set. And this was dungeons. Here's how they work. Dragons. Yep, there's dragons in the set. That's it.
Yeah, they mention ampersands, and Matt Tabak just says no, and I'm like, oh, I've already been disappointed by the massive lack of ampersands so far on cards, especially for this set. So I'm hoping that they're going to hook us the ampersands up at some point, but apparently not. Shutting down ampersands.
Yeah, what that means is that technically speaking, I think dungeons is the only mechanic, named mechanic.
Named new mechanic?
Named new mechanic.
Yeah.
You think so?
My assumption would be...
Well, they don't count flying and stuff like that as a mechanic.
Yeah, well, I guess that's what, I assume I assume there'll be evergreen, flying, sure, but also, maybe scry? I don't know.
Scry, I think, is an evergreen mechanic right now. We're going to get to it, but we see some more mechanics on these dungeons.
I mean, I'm super okay if there is no new mechanic outside of these dungeons, but there's also normal returning mechanics like scry or prowess or whatever, right? Sort of the more evergreen stuff that we are used to showing up in almost every set because it's just how the game works now, right?
It's definitely what I expect.
Yeah.
There's a card that got spoiled earlier we already talked about that makes a treasure token. There's a lot of evergreen mechanics now, or mechanics that we're sort of assuming will be evergreen because they've been in at least 5 sets or something.
But I mean, I can also see this being a streamlined set mechanically, since it is taking the calendar position of what would be the core set, and also hoping to bring, it's clearly hoping to bring more people into Magic the Gathering. So maybe it's just not that mechanically complex.
For sure.
Yeah, so I'm fine with that. I like these core sets with the bare minimum amount of new fancy words or no new mechanics at all.
Yeah.
And just trying to make it, often the draft environments are really elegant. They don't take that long to figure out if you're an experienced player, a veteran.
Mm-hmm.
If you've crawled several dungeons already through the plains of Magic the Gathering, you probably can get through a core set draft and know exactly which mistakes you made by the end of it. But it's still just nice. I don't know. I like that. I like having some drafts in the summertime. It's like, okay, yeah, I made these mistakes. This is how I punted this draft, and there's no second level to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I gotta say, like, and I figure we'll talk about each of these, but I think there's some pretty interesting decisions to be made with these dungeon cards, right? Like,
Yeah.
they are not just here's a dungeon card, progress it through like you would a saga or something, right? Like there's a decision tree that you need to make, and there are a lot. I mean, certainly one of them, there are a lot of decisions that you can make that lead you down different paths, which I think is really neat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm super stoked to see how that plays out in draft.
Yeah. So let's talk about what the dungeons are and what they do. So there's 3 dungeons, and they are magic cards. They're not tokens. They're magic cards in the same way that a contraption is a card.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of parallels drawn to contraptions from Unstable.
Yeah, I guess it's like a contraption.
Yeah. And you have access to all 3 of them. You don't have to draft them. They live sort of, well, they live in the command zone, essentially, is I think what they say in the article. And there are cards in the set that will tell you to venture into the dungeon. That's the keyword phrase, which I love, by the way. I'm glad that they didn't try to make that into like a single word keyword. I love that it's venture into the dungeon. And when you venture into the dungeon, you either put one of these 3 dungeons into play and you get to choose, or if you already have a dungeon in play, you move to the next room. So, or I should say, the first thing is you put a dungeon into play and move into the first room, or you then move to the next room. And the next room, as James said, there could be options. So, I mean, I said we were from the dungeon of the Mad Mage, so I guess we'll talk about that one. So if you put that into play, you enter the first room, the yawning portal, and you gain 1 life. That's it. So then the next time you venture, you move to the second room of the dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is called dungeon level, and you scry 1. Then you get to choose. You can either go to a goblin bazaar and create a treasure token, or the Twisted Caverns, and target creature can't attack until your next turn. Then you move into the lost level and scry 2. Then you can choose to either move into the Runestone Caverns to exile the top 2 cards of your library and you can play them, or into Muiral's Graveyard and create 2/2 black skeleton tokens. Then the paths converge again into Deep Mines, where you scry 3, and then finally, the last room of the Dungeon of the Mad Mage is the Mad Wizard's Lair, and you draw 3 cards and reveal them, and you can cast one of them without paying its mana cost.
Quick quirk. I feel like you said create 2 2/2s.
2 1/1s, my bad. Yeah.
Can I also go back and correct you just to actually be that guy? I just think someone at home probably is going to be like, so you put it into play, but really these cards
are not in play.
Yeah, they just hang out in the command zone, I think, or they're supposed to actually not, only one of them supposed to be in the command zone at once. So where the other ones go, I don't know.
They exist outside the game in the ether. I don't believe they're even in your sideboard. What Matt Tabak has said is that you just have access to them. Then you're correct. You get one, and it lives in the command zone while you're traipsing through it. So
right.
The one that I just said is also the biggest, because that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ventures to get all the way to the end room. The other ones are both 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3 if you pick a bad one to clear it more quickly.
Well, that could be like the Aristocrats one.
Yeah, well, that's to talk about it. So that's the Tomb of Annihilation. That's a classic. So the first room in that one is each player loses 1 life. And the last room is Cradle of the Death God, where you create the Atropal, a legendary 4/4 black god horror creature token with Death Touch. But to get there, either you take one path that has 2 rooms, so it takes more venturing to get there, which is each player loses 2 life unless they discard a card, and then each player loses 2 life unless they sacrifice an artifact, a creature, or land. Or you can go through the Oubliette and discard an artifact, a creature, and a land.
And discard a card and then sacrifice a creature, artifact, or land. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Discard a card and then sacrifice, yes, all 3 of those things.
So on the way here, on my bike ride to the base, I was trying to think about this room in particular and like whether or not there's already a deck in any format that's just hip to do all of these things like on turn 4 or 5, and it didn't immediately come to mind. But I feel like Sam Black's mind is out there somewhere turning on this same problem, and they'll come up with a solution, and suddenly there'll be the Tomb of Annihilation zombie deck or whatever, Plaguing Legacy or something like that.
I'm curious, do you need to do those in order to move into into that room, right?
If you don't have an artifact, then you don't have to sacrifice an artifact.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, so that's cool. If you have no cards in your hand and no permanents in play, you don't have to do anything.
Yeah, you just get to hang out in the oubliette for, however long it takes you to venture into the final. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's been a bit of... So we don't know how this is going to play. I think this is going to be fine, actually. I think it's going to be awesome in Limited. I don't think it's going to make a big splash in Standard, but please prove me wrong. The sort of the general negative reaction, if there is one, is that there's only, and I'm using air quotes around only, 3 dungeons. But I think an excellent point that I saw brought up is that if you had more, then that makes the first venture into a huge decision point, right? Basically, venture is a modal thing that's like choose one of these 3.
Yeah.
And every additional dungeon that you add increases the complexity of that initial modal choice greatly.
Yeah.
So I think this is fine, and they could always return to this mechanic later and just add another, like Modern Horizons 3, it'll be like, by the way, there's a 4th dungeon, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing to keep in mind too is that not only is that first decision made harder if you add more cards, but there's still decisions to be made within the actual dungeon itself, right? So like the dungeon of the Mad Mage is, it doesn't necessarily need to play the same way every time that you venture into that dungeon, right? Like sometimes it's going to make sense to go to the Goblin Bazaar and get that treasure token, and sometimes it's going to make more sense to go to the Twistern Caverns, which I think is kind of neat, a design space that they played around with, because I think it would have been very easy. I guarantee you that at some point these were just essentially sagas where there was 3 very linear choice or 3 linear effects, and you just moved your way down them. But instead of it happening automatically every turn with a like a saga does, you actually had to play a card to actually venture forward. So the idea that you have to make those decisions in the actual dungeon itself, I think is super neat as well, and something I'm pretty excited to play around with, especially in draft. I think this is going to be kind of unlike anything that we've had before, which is great, right? Like,
yeah.
This is what I want out of a limited format, is cards like this that let me do fun, weird things. So
there was a really interesting design article that I saw somebody link to discussing a mechanic that they tried to make work in War of the Spark called Skirmish, which works... The way that it's described in Rosewater's design article is very similar to this, where you bring in some sort of thing outside the game and then you progress through. This is a skirmish you are having in the greater battle in War of the Spark, and you progress your way through it, and then when you get to the end, you get a prize, basically, sort of thing. And I mean, he mentions in that article contraptions sort of showing that this kind of thing could work, and then they were working on Skirmish and War of the Spark, and ultimately they didn't use it in War of the Spark. He said not because it wasn't fun, like it worked and it was fun and it was a good mechanic, but it didn't actually do what we needed it to do for the set, right? Like it didn't actually support the set in the way that we thought.
Right.
And this sounds very similar to what he's describing in that original article, and this makes sense, right? It's Dungeons and Dragons. Here's the dungeons. This totally works for me.
Yeah, I think the flavor of it is a knockout of the park. Although I will say I don't love looking at these cards that are all text, but I'm sure there's going to be tons of... We've already seen like hella glorious art from this set and all these variants and stuff, so sacrifices need to be made.
Yeah. I've already seen people make very cool looking altars, of these like very like fancy artistic interpretations. I already saw someone like make one out of there's the dungeon. They're not called dungeon tiles, but like the 3D walls and floor that you can use to like mix and match like Lego. You can make like a mini map for your D&D figures. Someone used that to like make these layouts and was like, look, I'm bringing this to the first Magic Fest I go to. Try and stop me,
Oh, that's sweet. Yeah, that's awesome.
So that sounds super cool. And we also saw a couple cards that let you venture into the dungeon. So let's talk a little bit about those. So the first one, the flashiest one certainly, is Nader, Selfless Paladin. I love this. I didn't notice this, but I saw somebody on the internet point this out, that Nader is one of the, I don't remember from what edition, but it's one of the it's the first name in the rule book as a suggested name for a dragonkin.
That's awesome.
And apparently there's a couple other ones like that. Like I think actually Ellie Wick as well is like one of the, it's like the names from the like suggested, if you're playing one of these creatures, you could use this name, and then they're taking those names and making them into actual people, which I think is really cool. So Nader, Selfless Paladin, is 2 and a white for a 3/3 dragon knight, because he's He's a Dragonborn, a legendary creature. Vigilance, so 3/3 Vigilance for 3, already on board. Whenever Nader Selfless Paladin enters the battlefield or attacks, venture into the dungeon. Very nice. And then other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you have completed a dungeon.
Yeah, I dig that. I dig the fact that you are rewarded beyond just whatever lays at the end of the dungeon, and it actually translates into the game and effects on cards and stuff like that, which I think is great. So
yeah. And so what's nice is even if this creature dies immediately, right? Even the worst case where you cast, I'm not talking about it being countered, but if you cast it, enters the battlefield, and is killed immediately, you still get to put a dungeon down. So you still get to either scry one, gain a life, or each player loses a life. Maybe you don't want that one, but you still get the first room of one of these dungeons. If you play Nader and get to attack with Nader, then you're already on the second room of a dungeon. That seems sweet. And what's nice about that is that it's not like, it's like, yeah, it's a cool rare. It's a 3/3 Vigilance for 3, which is fine, but it's not really good unless you can support it in this other way. Because you can just do that, right? Like the thing that sort of like kicks it up to being a legendary creature and a rare doesn't actually require additional support. Like in draft, you don't need to draft around that because you can just do it.
Right. This, unlike some, like if there's some other venture creatures that just enter the battlefield, this venture into the dungeon, and you just get it once, you're going to want some sort of critical mass so that you can get through these dungeons, especially if you're also playing cards that reward you like Nader also does, with that last ability giving +1/+1 as long as you completed a dungeon. You're going to want, that to be like part of your strategy. But I imagine there's going to be several cards that do it more than once, and we'll be seeing a lot of these decks venturing into the dungeon.
I mean, I would assume that, venture into the dungeon is going to be shared among all 5 colors. It feels a lot like, in terms of like, you need this many to make this work in terms of like lessons, right? From Strixhaven, where you needed to feel like you had like, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 learn cards to really take advantage of all the lessons that you can draft. But here you don't even need to worry about drafting the lessons. You just get the dungeons. So I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah. They showed off a common as well, the Shortcut Seeker. Great flavor there. 3 and a blue for a 2/5 human rogue. Whenever a Shortcut Seeker deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. Definitely less likely to reliably happen, but nice that there are at least some common enablers.
I'm disappointed they didn't make this a crab. Like, I get it.
Because it's a 2/5?
Well, yeah, I've had like a weird long-standing love affair with the 3 generic 1 blue 2/5 common. And it doesn't usually have an ability. Like, its ability is that it has 5 toughness, and it's almost always a crab. But this is like my favorite 23rd card in a draft deck, where I'm just like, well,
it blocks.
This thing blocks 4/4s. This thing is going to like keep me alive until I can rip the extra flyer and get through in the air. If I'm doing well enough, this thing might even attack. It just is like training wheels.
Yep.
It just feels good to be stable and having crabs on your team. But I understand they needed to make it the rogue because it's the D&D set.
Then they also showed off the Gloom Stalker, which is 2 and a white for a 2/3 dwarf ranger that says, as long as you have completed a dungeon, Gloom Stalker has double strike. And that's just a static thing. You don't have to, they say in the article, you don't have to control the Gloom Stalker when you complete a dungeon. It's just once you complete a dungeon, meaning once the ability of the last room resolves, the dungeon is removed from the game. And you just have like it's not an emblem, but it's a thing. I guess it's like City's Blessing.
Yeah, I was going to say City's Blessing exactly. Yeah,
I'm hoping they're going to put a token in the cart in the packs that looks like the City's Blessing, but just like I completed the dungeon and all I got was this lousy T-shirt.
It'll probably on Arena. It'll probably show up in that little like effects zone on the left hand side, the like little thing. So it's a 2/3 for 3, which is fine. Again, in draft, it's fine. But if it has double strike, hey, cool.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess a lot of it will just sort of hinge on how many ways you can venture into a dungeon. Let's talk about the third dungeon. So the Lost Mine of Fandor. So the first room is Scry 1, and then you can choose 1 of 2 directions. To the Goblin Lair to create a 1/1 Goblin Creature token, or the Mine Tunnels to create a treasure token. And then from those 2, you can either reconverge at the Dark Pool, where each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Or from the Goblin Lair, you can go into the Storeroom, where you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. From the Mine Tunnels, you can go into the Fungi Cavern, where target creature gets -4/-0 until your next turn. And then all 3 of those rooms take you into the last room, the Temple of Dumathoin, where you draw a card. So like what I like about these is that they're not big effects, but I mean, they're kind of free. Like you hope that they're kind of free, right? Like Nader, you would play just as a 3/3 vigilance for 3 anyway. That's just a good card. The Shortcut Seeker, maybe not. So like maybe this, I mean, like I would and Nelson would obviously, but maybe you don't want to attack with Shortcut Seeker. This might encourage you to attack. So it's like, well, I might not attack with this, but if I do, I get to drain them for 1, and that's probably fine. So it'll be interesting to see how good, it's not just how many there are, how many cards venture, but like how good the cards would be otherwise to maintain these effects being a fun bonus rather than acting like these are a huge payoff for running an underwhelming card that just happens to say that you get to venture.
Yeah, certainly none of the dungeons are going to be like a strategy in and of themselves. They're all just like, we said earlier, but I want to reiterate, a really interesting, massive pile of decision trees with like lots of words on them and the ability to do lots of different things that might help you, like making your opponent lose 2 life unless they discard, getting a +1/+1 counter, treasure, drawing cards, like, and in different situations will have different levels of value of the effect. But none of these dungeons are like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to build a dungeon in the Mad Mage deck, right? Like I don't think we're going to see that. It's going to be like all in-game decisions and just, yeah, I agree. If we see venture cards that are really good without venture, then those cards will be good. And I think we probably will see some of these cards in Constructed.
Yeah. I mean, they've already said, sort of like unofficially, Sheldon Menery in the Commander Discord said that they'll be legal in Commander because there's no reason that they shouldn't be. So there's that.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that they'll be legal in Canadian Highlander because I just don't see the problem. But that'll be for the full council to decide. I suppose we did ban Companion. We had a reason for that.
Yeah, but there's not. They don't live in your sideboard because Canadian Highlander doesn't have a sideboard.
Yeah, exactly.
Gladiator doesn't have a sideboard, but these don't live in your sideboard. They just exist outside the game, and you can get them. So
I'm actually curious where these are gonna live on Arena because we talked about completing the dungeon being a little icon, but maybe these will just sort of pop up every time you resolve venture.
Yeah, I think whenever you resolve your first venture card, it'll be like, all right, pick one of the 3 dungeons. Here you go.
I feel like on the board, it'll probably live like where sagas and planeswalkers do.
I was going to say live over by the enchantment saga. Yeah.
Right.
Planeswalker area, bottom right.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 2 more here. We have Dungeon Crawler, which is a 2/1 zombie for 1 black.
I'm in love already.
The classic enters the battlefield tapped. And whenever you complete a dungeon, you may return Dungeon Crawler from your graveyard to your hand.
Oh, good. The adventurers are gone. Now I can come back to life.
So Nader and the Gloom Stalker and Dungeon Crawler all make me think that Wizards thinks that we're going to be completing dungeons like regularly enough to make these cards not terrible.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, right? Because I read this card and I read Nader as well, and I'm like, how often are we expected to complete a dungeon in an average game of Limited in this format? Because when I first saw them, I was like, okay, this seems like a cool thing I'll probably do once, I guess. But like, this isn't like, but with Nader, that's like a static, like once you've completed a dungeon, your other creatures you control get +1/+1, right? And as long as you've completed a dungeon, Gloom Stalker has double strike. You only need to ever complete 1 dungeon to turn those on. It's the same with the Cloister Gargoyle, which we'll talk about in a second. But with Dungeon Crawler, this is saying whenever you complete a dungeon, you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. Not even from the graveyard to your battlefield, which honestly probably seems fine to me as well. I guess maybe it's going to happen more than I think it is. Or maybe this is just a bad card. Right.
Well, hold, pump the brakes here.
Yeah.
It's a 2/1 for 1.
Yes.
It can only be so bad. Like, we can't even really call it bad. It would need to like come into play tapped and give your opponent a 3/3 for it to be bad.
Sure.
Like, coming into play tapped and being a 2/1 for 1 black is already a stellar card. It's in like the top 100 best cards in Magic that are in my Canadian Highlander deck. But yeah, maybe it's only ever coming back like 1 time.
Right. And that's, that's good, right? Like, I'll take it. Although you have to wonder how good a 2/1 for 1 that comes in tapped is going to be by the time you're completing a dungeon in a game of Limited. Like, I can't see that having a massive impact, but maybe it's good enough. The other card that we got is Cloister Gargoyle. This is a 0/4 Gargoyle artifact creature for 2 and a white. When it enters a battlefield, venture into a dungeon. And as long as you've completed a dungeon, Cloister Gargoyle gets +3/+0 and has flying.
Man, again. And this is another uncommon. So they definitely think we're going to just churn through dungeons.
Well, there is one you can do in 3, right? As long as you're willing to sacrifice a land and a creature and discard a card.
I mean, yeah, with like when you think about Tomb of Annihilation and something like Nader, where it's just like, okay, on turn 3, I play Nader, each player loses a life, and I untap with Nader and I attack, all of a sudden I can put myself in the oubliette. And if I have something else to venture into a dungeon, all of a sudden I'm done, right? Like you just finish it in 2 turns. So, you know, it does feel like something you could do pretty quick. And also now you have a 4/4, which seems pretty good.
I mean, maybe they're going to give us like 3 mana, tap, add a mana of any color, pay 2 and sacrifice this, venture into the dungeon. Or pay 4 and tap and venture into the dungeon, right? Maybe they're going to give us like 1 green, venture into the dungeon, sorcery.
I mean, turn 1, dungeon crawler. Turn 2, don't care. Turn 3, Nader. Turn 4, attack with Nader, move to the oubliette, sacrifice the dungeon crawler, play another venture card, bring the crawler back. Feels good. Get a 4/4. We're win. I just broke the format with those 3 cards. I did it.
There you go.
I'm a genius.
Way to break Magic in half.
I did it. I'm the smartest Magic player of all time. They could probably just stop spoiling the set. Let's move on to Innistrad.
Okay, give us at least 2 podcast episodes of that one before you snap it in half, all right?
Yeah, no problem.
So they did show off a couple other things. They've released all the basic lands, which, as we mentioned, have flavor text. So that's cool. Not going to read them all out right now, but that was neat. In the same Polygon article, they also showed off a different variant art treatment for lands. They showed off an Evolving Wilds that looks like the cover art for very old Dungeons and Dragons adventure modules. And I mean, I said as much on my Twitter. I think these are ugly, and I'm so happy. I love them. I need a bunch of these. These are great.
I also can't wait to pick these up. I look at this like 70s official TSR adventure module Evolving Wilds, and I can feel, I'm having the weirdest memory right now. I can feel the corduroy of the like sun faded like brown and orange couch that, you know, my family had in my childhood. Just like, you know, the corduroy covered couch where it would like, on certain spots where you'd put your arm too often, it was like wearing down and it was thin in some places. It's like you look at this and you're like, oh yeah, they just built the Montreal Metro and it's all got like cool lines of many different shades of brown down there.
Yeah, it's super cool. I assume there's more than just Evolving Wilds. They haven't shown any others. I also assume that this particular one is purple because Evolving Wilds can go looking for any color of mana. I predict that if there's ones that tap for specific colors of mana, that'll be reflected in the color of the art. But yeah, I mean, like obviously these look nothing like Magic cards. Cue the Ristic Studies video, which you should all go watch if you haven't already, on Magic card frames. And there's like extraneous text, like an adventure for characters levels 1 to 4. But God, this is so in the weeds. I love it so much.
Yeah, I am a big fan. I know it keeps in, you know, it looks exactly like the old D&D books, which is great. I've never been a big fan. I love borders. I'm a big fan of borders, just to break up the image right on top of on the purple base of the card. And I saw somebody do up just a really nice, just fine black border, and I just liked it infinitely more. It just felt a little bit more clean and modern. But yeah, overall, I think these are fantastic. These are the exact kind of cards that I look at and I go, I want to collect all of those and frame them, but I never do.
Yeah.
Like I've done it with every other, you know, even with the Mystical Archives. I was like, ooh, I want to collect all of those and frame them. I never did that. I never will. It's the same for this. I probably won't. I could see myself getting a few of them depending on what other cards exist in this treatment, but I do love it. I think it's great.
I think I probably brought this up last year and the year before too, but like hopefully sometime soon, especially after we're back to playing in Magic Fest, there'll be a big update to the official tournament policy on which altars are allowed in tournaments and which aren't, because in the current wording, it's like, well, if you have someone paint on your card and it no longer resembles that card, like that card's art, then you're not allowed to do that. Or if you like, you know, if the name is obscured, or like if the type line is obscured, that's not okay. And it's like, well, now they have all these variants that are official and they've printed them, and like, you know, like the Secret Lair rock poster ones that I really love. And this, they just don't look anything like a Magic card at all.
I remember. I can't remember who somebody mentioned sort of losing glanceability on this card the other day, and I was like, I feel like that ship sailed about 6 secret layers ago. Like we are
Yeah.
so far past, glanceability on Magic cards at this point, like official
Yeah.
Magic cards, that we
Mhm.
do need to make sure that
The MTR is back in like 2017 though.
especially with bigger events, I think that is fair. Just being very clear about these ridiculous looking cards, because like you're going to run into game after game at GPs where there are thousands of people, and some are going to sit down across from this card and be like, what is that? Like, I've never seen that before. That's not a Magic card.
For sure.
That said, they did a secret layer of extra cards for the Mystical Archive, right? In the same sort of style as all the Mystical Archive cards, with like All Is Dust and Drown in the Loch and whatever in it. And I definitely hope that they do like a secret layer with like more classic old school Magic lands with this treatment.
Yeah, that'd be sweet.
All right, one more card to talk about that's been spoiled before we wrap up for the day. A Planeswalker and a brand new character. Obviously, we've seen we've got Dritz and Lolth, and we've, classic D&D characters. This is a character that apparently is featuring in a forthcoming Dungeons & Dragons adventure. This is the Bard Ellie Wick Tumblestrum, which definitely sounds like a name that somebody would make up for their bard. And she's a Planeswalker for the purposes of Magic anyway. 2 green for 4 loyalty. Sounds great. +1, venture into the dungeon. Hey,
Like it.
all right. -2, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. If it's legendary, you gain 3 life. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. I like that as the bard supporting the party.
Right.
That it's like if it's a legendary creature, then there's a benefit. Like she's singing a better song, I guess. And then -7, you get an emblem with creatures you control have trample and haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed.
So best case, and it seems, I mean, the emblem would update as you go, right? But
yeah.
So best case, this is +6/+6 with trample.
I feel like they'll probably concede before that happens, but
even just worst case, +2/+2 and trample. I mean, the overrun is no joke, and this is a little worse, but it's still good.
No, they get haste. I mean that. Yeah.
Oh God, they do.
They get haste. So it's like it's not +3/+3, but it's still really good.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like worst case is they actually only get trample and haste, and you haven't yet completed a dungeon. But
oh, that's right. You can -7
to get Ellie Wick if you play Ellie Wick and point her up to 8 loyalty, so that when you -7 she doesn't die.
Yeah,
you would have completed one of the 2 dungeons that aren't the Dungeon of the Mad Mage by that point.
Yeah.
So, but technically speaking, you could get the emblem without having completed a dungeon. But that seems, again, I feel like this is going to be one of those things like one of those big Ugin ultimates that's like, it wins you the game. You never actually do it, but it technically wins you the game because it's like, I'm going to ultimate my Planeswalker, and your opponent's like, all right, cool. Well, let's go to game 2 then.
Yeah, so I just want to say, again, about venture into the dungeon. Oh, also, I didn't say this before, but this thing is 4 words long, and you were saying you love that. I kind of low-key hate it.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, well, I guess they used adventure in Throne of Eldraine already. Also because we found out that this set only has this one mechanic, that means we aren't going to get adventure cards and we aren't going to get party cards in this set. And we had been wondering about that, right? At least if they didn't feel the need to tell us that in the mechanics article. But maybe when the full spoiler's done, we'll find out. But yeah, it's like, I just feel weird that it's so many words because so few keyword abilities are. Like, there's first strike and double strike that I can think of, but are there any other that are like even 2 or 3 words? It's okay. Anyways, I think if there's enough cards that are Nader and Ellie Wick where you very easily can repeat venturing into the dungeon, then certainly there'll be constructed decks that are kind of built around venturing into the dungeon and do play like a critical mass of these solid venture into the dungeon cards, because completing the dungeons all have it's a reasonable reward, right? Like, you're drawing cards, you're making 4/4s, and you're casting free spells. So yeah, and I think Ellie Wick certainly +1 to venture into the dungeon. That's nice. That's all. Yeah, I just think we've seen the rare and the mythic here could definitely get into constructed decks.
Yeah, I think she seems sweet. I continue to be more and more excited about this set.
Yeah, I'm really stoked it's coming to Arena.
Yes. Also that.
But hey, if Arena's not your thing, check out cardkingdom.com and go to .com/LRR to let them know we sent you, and you'll get a little 1-inch button if you ask for it that says changelings are cowards, although apparently there's a typo.
Changelings also can't spell.
Changelings can't spell, and neither can we.
Yeah.
We're in Canada. Everything has 3 U's in it.
Changeling.
Yeah, that's right. Changelings. Yeah, they're going to ship your sealed product from non-standard sets anywhere in the world, singles anywhere in the world, and new sealed product only in the United States. But whatever you're getting, they will do it super quickly. You'll think that they used a portable hole network to magic your cards to you through another dimension, but really they just shipped it. Wow, that was a really unfunny joke about shipping. To try to help Nelson write better jokes about shipping in the future, continue to support us over at patreon.com/loading-ready-run. We need to feed Nelson more food or hydrate him better during this heat wave.
Get him some Powerade.
I went through 2 vitamin waters while we were recording this, but clearly it's not enough. So thank you for your support. Please continue to support us so that hopefully our brains work and we can write great jokes. Graham, is there any other business?
No, that is going to do it. Until next time on Tap Tap Concede, I've been Graham, joined by Nelson.
Yep.
And James.
Bye.
Who was also running the card reader. Jordan edits these. Heather gets them online. Thank you all for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.